The order came down on a scrap of wet parchment, and Novan read it twice because he didn't believe it the first time. 12 soldiers, 1 mountain, no siege equipment, no reinforcements. The Dragon Vayak had taken the Keldun Pass 3 days ago, and without that pass, the army's supply line was dead. Every company commander had refused the mission. Novan was not a company commander. He was a sergeant with a broken sword and 11 men who trusted him because he had never once lied to them. He folded the parchment and put it in his coat. He went and told his men. None of them said yes immediately. Dawn, the oldest among them, sat on a supply crate and stared at the ground for a long time. Petra, who had joined the army to pay off a family debt, asked how far the mountain was. When Novan said 2 days on foot, she nodded slowly, like that was an answer she could work with. Bren was the youngest, 17, maybe 18, nobody was entirely sure, and he asked only one question: what does a dragon smell like when it's close? Novan said he didn't know. Bren said, then I guess we'll find out. That was as close to agreement as any of them gave, and Novan took it. They left before dawn, no torches. The mountain path was old and overgrown, a shepherd's route that hadn't been used since the pass fell. Novan had a hand-drawn map from a woman in the last village, the only person who had gone up that path recently and come back down. She had gone up to look for her husband, who had been working the pass road when Vayak came. She came back alone. She drew the map without speaking. When she handed it to him, she touched his wrist for just a moment. Then she went back inside. The path was steep and loose with shale. 3 men fell in the first hour, none badly, but it slowed them. By midday they were above the tree line, and the cold settled on them like something with weight. Novan rationed the bread. He kept count of the water. By nightfall they could see the pass below them, or what remained of it. Vayak had not just taken the pass, he had remade it. The old gatehouse was gone, the 2 watchtowers were rubble. In their place, at the narrowest point between the cliffs, the dragon had dragged enormous boulders into a rough wall, not strategic, not military, just a demonstration. A creature with enough strength to move a mountain doing so because it could. Vayak himself was visible in the last light, coiled on the far side of the boulder wall, his back to the wind. He was enormous, the accounts hadn't lied about that. His scales were deep grey, almost black, and his head alone was the size of a small house. He was sleeping, or something close to it. His breath came in long, slow intervals, each exhale a small cloud of steam in the cold air. Novan looked at him for a long time. Then he looked at the boulder wall. Then he looked at his 11 soldiers, who were all looking at him. He said, "We're not here to kill him." Dawn said, "Then what are we here for?" Novan said, "The wall. If the wall comes down, the pass opens. Vayak's just the reason nobody's moved the stones yet." Petra said, "He'll wake up." Novan said, "Yes." Nobody said anything for a moment. Then Bren said, "So the plan is to move the boulders while a dragon watches." Novan said, "While a dragon sleeps, mostly." It was a terrible plan, he knew it, all of them knew it, but the parchment in his coat had said no siege equipment and no reinforcements, and the only other option was going back down the mountain and watching the army starve by degrees. He split them into 3 groups. 2 groups would work the boulders. The wall had 4 main anchor stones at its base. Remove those, and the whole structure would shift. The 3rd group, himself and Bren, would stay near Vayak, not to fight him, just to watch, to give the others 10 seconds of warning if he woke. 10 seconds wasn't much, but it was something. They came down off the high ground in silence, moving slow, keeping low. The shale was the enemy, every step was a negotiation. Dawn's group reached the left anchor stone first. Novan could see them working in the dark, hands on the rock, testing its weight. He and Bren crouched behind a spur of the cliff, 30 feet from Vayak's head. The dragon's eye was closed, his ribs rose and fell. Novan realized his own hands were shaking, and he made them stop, because there was no point in shaking. Whatever happened next would happen whether his hands were steady or not. He might as well be steady. Bren was looking at Vayak with something that wasn't quite fear. It was closer to the look a person gets when they see something truly enormous for the first time, not terror, but a kind of recalibration, like the mind going quiet to make room for the size of it. Then Bren looked at Novan, and he almost smiled. He whispered, "We are actually doing this." Novan whispered back, "We are actually doing this." From across the pass came the low groan of the first anchor stone beginning to move. Vayek woke when the second anchor stone moved. Not because of the sound, because of the vibration. Dragons feel stone the way humans feel wind, through something older than thought, something in the bone. He had been coiled on this mountain for 3 days, and the mountain had been still, and then it wasn't, and so he opened his eyes. The first thing he saw was 2 humans crouched behind a spur of rock 30 feet away, both of them staring directly at him and not moving at all. He looked at them for a moment. Then he looked past them to where 4 more humans were pressed against the boulder wall, hands on the stone, completely frozen. He looked at the wall, he looked at the humans. He understood the geometry of it immediately because Vayek was not stupid. He was ancient and careful, and he had survived centuries by reading situations quickly. What he could not understand was the why. These were soldiers. He could smell the leather and iron, the sweat of a long march, the specific exhaustion of people who had been moving for 2 days with not enough food. He could also smell that they were afraid, all of them. The fear was constant and sharp, the kind that doesn't go away, not the brief spike of surprise, but the long, grinding fear of people doing something they know is very likely to kill them. And yet they had come up the mountain anyway. And they were still moving the stones. The 2 near him hadn't run. The one with the broken sword on his belt, the older one, the one who carried himself like someone used to making decisions, was still crouched behind the rock, watching Vayek with steady eyes. Not the eyes of a hero. Not the wild, performed courage that young soldiers sometimes put on like armor. Just steady, like a man who had already accepted the worst outcome and was working within it. Vayek found that more unsettling than any weapon. He raised his head. The movement was slow, deliberate. He had no need to be fast. There was nowhere for them to run that he couldn't reach in 2 seconds. The steady-eyed one stood up. Not attacking, not threatening. He just stood up, like he'd decided crouching was pointless, and he looked at Vayek directly. He said, "We're not here for you." Vayek said nothing. He didn't speak to humans often. There was rarely a point, but he was listening. The man said, "We need the pass open. That's all. We're not here to fight you. We're not here to take the mountain. We just need to move the wall." Vayek turned his head and looked at the wall again. Half a night's work, maybe less, to rebuild it once these humans were gone. He said, "You climbed this mountain, in the dark, to move stones." The man said, "Yes. Knowing I was here." "Yes." Vayek looked at the others at the wall. They had not run either. They were still standing there, hands at their sides now, waiting. The young one, the smallest of them, was visibly trembling, but he hadn't run. "Why didn't you go around?" Vayek said. "There are other passes." 3 days further south, the man said. "The army doesn't have 3 days." Vayek said, "What army?" The man said the name of the kingdom. Vayek had heard of it. It was not significant. He had watched kingdoms rise and fall for 200 years, and they were all roughly the same, brief, noisy, convinced of their own importance. He said, "Your kingdom will fall regardless." The man said, "Probably, but not today." Something about the way he said it made Vayek pause. Not defiance. The man wasn't performing anything. It was just a true statement, the way you'd say rain is cold or stone is heavy. Your kingdom will fall, probably, but not today. Vayek could kill them all right now. It would take very little effort. The small trembling one would be the first to die, because he was the most afraid, and yet he was still standing there, which meant he was either very brave or very stupid. And Vayek had been alive long enough to know those were often the same thing. He looked at the steady-eyed one again. He said, "You know you can't carry the stones down. The wall won't come down from the inside. You'd need to break the anchor stones apart." The man said, "We know. You don't have anything to break them with." The man reached into his coat and produced 4 small, dense-wrapped bundles. Novan set them on the ground carefully. He said, "We do." Vayek stared at the bundles. He could smell the alchemical compound inside, sulfur and something sharp and mineral. He had smelled it before on human battlefields. He knew what it did. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "You planned this." The man said, "We planned this. 12 soldiers and a packet of powder. 11 soldiers and a packet of powder. Bren is 17. The young trembling one made a sound that was almost a laugh and immediately smothered it. Vayek looked at all of them again. This strange, underfed, determined collection of humans who had climbed his mountain in the dark with a bad map and a plan that should not have worked and was still, somehow, standing here talking to him. He thought about the wall he had built. He thought about how long it would take to rebuild. He thought about 200 years and kingdoms falling and the specific look on the steady-eyed man's face, not hope exactly, but something very close to it. The look of someone who still believed that what they did today would matter tomorrow. He said, "Move your people back from the wall." The man looked at him carefully. "Why?" Vayek said, "Because I am going to save you the powder." He stood, he stretched, and he turned toward the boulder wall and began to pull it apart himself. Word reached the camp by mid-morning. The pass was open. The messenger came down the south road at a dead run, and the news moved through the camp faster than fire through dry grass. By the time the supply wagons began to roll, soldiers were lining both sides of the road just to watch. Not because supply wagons were impressive, because the pass had been closed, and then it wasn't, and 12 soldiers had done what 3 full companies had refused. General Korath met Novan at the camp gate. She was a tall woman, gray at the temples, with the permanent squint of someone who had spent too many years reading maps in bad light. She looked at Novan and his 11 soldiers and said nothing for a long moment. Then she said, "The pass is open." Novan said, "Yes." "The dragon. He's still on the mountain." Korath's expression changed, not dramatically. She was not a dramatic woman, but something shifted in it. She said, "He let you past." Novan said, "He opened the wall himself." The silence that followed was the kind that has weight. Korath looked at the soldiers behind Novan, all 11 of them, dirty and exhausted and carrying nothing impressive. She looked at Bren, who had fallen asleep standing up and was being quietly held upright by Petra. She said, "Why?" Novan said, "I don't think I know exactly, but he asked questions, real ones. He listened to the answers." Korath said, "You talked to it." To him, Novan said, "Yes." Another silence, then Korath said, "Come inside," and that was that. But the story was already loose in the camp, and stories like that don't stay small. By nightfall, the shape of it had changed in the telling. Novan had bargained with the dragon. Novan had threatened the dragon. Novan had somehow tricked the dragon. By the following morning, 3 different soldiers claimed to have been there themselves. Novan didn't correct any of it. There was no point. What he thought about, alone in his tent that night, was the moment just before Vayek turned to the wall. The dragon had looked at them, all 12 of them, with an expression that Novan could only describe, and only to himself, as confused, not the bafflement of something that didn't understand a threat, something more careful than that, like a scholar encountering a sentence that doesn't parse the way it should. He had said very quietly, almost to himself, "You are all afraid." Novan had said, "Yes." And yet. Novan had said, "And yet." That was the whole of it, 2 words, but something in them had moved through the dragon like a change in weather, and then Vayek had stood and gone to the wall. Novan didn't know what that meant. He wasn't sure it was his to understand. He had gone up the mountain to open a pass, and the pass was open, and his soldiers were alive. That was the boundary of what he had set out to do. 3 days later, Vayek came down from the mountain. He arrived at the edge of the camp without warning, simply appeared at the tree line to the north as the sun came up, and stood there and waited. 2 sentries fainted. A third ran for Korath. A fourth, to his lasting embarrassment, threw his breakfast at the dragon out of pure reflex. Vayak ignored all of this. He waited until Novan came out. When Novan appeared, Vayak looked at him and said, "I have been thinking about what you said." Novan said, "I said a lot of things. You said your kingdom will probably fall, but not today." Novan said, "That's still true." Vayak said, "I want to know what happens after today, for you." Novan looked at the dragon for a long moment. Behind him, he could feel the camp going absolutely still. Hundreds of soldiers stopped in place, listening. He said, "We push the supply line through the pass. We resupply the eastern garrison. We hold the river crossing at Velt for as long as we can. Then we fall back to Dunhall and we make them come through the valley." He paused. "It won't be enough. There are 3 other dragon clans moving on the western territories. We might hold a year, maybe 2. Vayak said, "And after 2 years?" Novan said, "I don't know. We're still working on that part." For a long moment, the dragon didn't move. Then he said, "The Karas clans are moving on the western territories because the Merit clan asked them to. The Merit clan controls the high ground north of your river crossing. If the high ground changes, the Karas clan's agreement falls apart. They only came south for guaranteed territory. Take away the guarantee, they go home." Novan stared at him. "How do you know that?" Vayak said, "Because I was at the meeting where it was decided. 300 years ago, I sat in on the Merit gathering. I remember everything I hear. It is one of the few useful things about being very old." He waited. Novan said, carefully, "You came here to tell us that." Vayak said, "I came here because you are afraid and you keep doing things anyway, and in 200 years, I have not once understood why. I would like to be nearby while I continue to not understand it." He paused. "If you will have me." Novan turned around. The camp was entirely silent behind him, hundreds of faces, all watching. He turned back to Vayak. He said, "We don't have much to offer a dragon." Vayak said, "I am not asking to be paid." Novan said, "Then yes, we'll have you." Somewhere behind him, Bren started clapping. It was very loud and very alone for about 2 seconds, and then, slowly, it was not alone at all. The Merit clan sent a messenger to the human camp on the 4th morning of the new alliance, a young male dragon, barely a century old, with a message scroll tied around his leg like a hawk's parcel. He landed at the edge of the camp, looked at Vayak with a complicated expression, and said, "Elder, the clan lords are asking." Vayak said, "Let them ask." The young dragon unrolled the scroll and read from it in the formal tongue. Novan couldn't follow the full language, but Vayak translated quietly, standing beside him, as if they were 2 men in a market watching a street performance. The message was simple. Vayak was to leave the human camp and return to the range before the next full moon, or the Merit clan would consider his alliance with the humans an act of war against dragon kind. When the reading was done, Novan said, "That's a threat." Vayak said, "Yes." Novan said, "Does it concern you?" Vayak thought about it genuinely slowly, the way he thought about most things. Then he said, "The Merit clan has not gone to war with another dragon in 40 years. They are territorial, but they prefer agreements to fighting. They sent a messenger instead of acting. That means they are uncertain." He paused. "Uncertain creatures make threats to see if the threats work. If they don't work, they recalculate." Novan said, "So we don't respond." Vayak said, "We respond, but not the way they expect." He turned to the young messenger, who was still standing there looking deeply uncomfortable, and he said, in the common tongue, not the formal one, which was itself a message, "Tell the clan lords that I will leave the human camp when I decide to. Not when they decide. And tell them that if they'd like to know why, they are welcome to come and ask me themselves." The young dragon looked alarmed. "Elder, I don't think." "You are a messenger," Vayak said, "not a negotiator. Deliver the message." The young dragon left. Novan watched him go and then looked at Vayek. Was that wise? Vayek said, probably not, but it was accurate. Over the next 2 weeks, something strange happened. 3 more Dragon Clan envoys came to the camp, not from the Merit, but from smaller clans in the Eastern Range. They came not with threats but with questions. They had heard about Keldun Pass. They had heard about the agreement. They had heard that Vayek, who had not spoken to another dragon in 40 years, was sleeping near a human camp and eating their food and talking to their sergeant. They wanted to know why. Vayek told them the same thing each time, in his careful, slow way. I have been watching humans lose for 30 years. I wanted to be nearby when they decided to stop. None of the envoys knew what to make of that. But none of them delivered threats either. The situation changed on a Tuesday, not that dragons noted the day, but Novan would remember it because he'd been mending a boot and he had just run out of thread. Dawn came to him with news from the Eastern Scouts. The Karath clans had begun their march south 6 days earlier than projected. The intelligence Vayek had provided about the high ground was good. The Merit clan held the northern ridgeline, and if the human forces could dislodge them, the Karath agreement would dissolve. But dislodging the Merit from a ridgeline was not a 12-soldier problem. It was a full engagement problem. It required committing the eastern garrison, stripping the river crossing, and moving Korath's main force north, all at the same time, coordinated, which required communication across 100 miles of broken country in less than 4 days. Novan brought it to Korath. Korath spread the map on the table, stared at it, and said, "We can't communicate across that distance in 4 days. The riders alone take 3 days each way." Novan said, "Riders, yes." Korath looked at him. He said, "Vayek can fly that distance in a day, there and back." Korath said, "You want to send a dragon as a messenger." Novan said, "He's done stranger things already." Korath was quiet. She was not a woman who made fast decisions, which was part of why she had survived this long. She looked at the map for another minute. Then she said, "Ask him." Novan went to Vayek, who was sitting at the northern edge of the camp watching the mountains, which he did most mornings. He explained the situation, all of it. He didn't simplify it or make it sound like less than it was. Vayek listened without interrupting. When Novan was done, the dragon said, "You want me to carry messages between 3 separate forces across 100 miles of territory in 4 days?" Novan said, "Yes." Vayek said, "That is errand work." Novan said, "It is, and it might save the army." Vayek looked at him with that careful expression, the one Novan had come to recognize as Vayek thinking about something that didn't fit neatly into categories. He said, "You know that if the Eastern Garrison commander refuses to move on my word alone, none of this works." Novan said, "I know. And you're asking anyway." "I'm asking anyway." Vayek stood. He stretched his wings, the full span of them, which was enormous, and which still made everyone nearby take a reflexive step back, which Vayek had stopped appearing to notice. He said, "I will need something to carry. A seal, or a letter, or some object the commanders will recognize as coming from Korath." Novan said, "We have a seal." Vayek said, "Then I will leave at first light." He folded his wings. He looked north at the mountains for one more moment. He said quietly, almost to the mountains, "I went 40 years without being needed for anything." Novan didn't say anything. Vayek said, "It is a stranger feeling, being needed. I am not sure yet if I like it." He settled back onto the ground, and the camp went on around him, and the stars came out one by one, and 4 days remained. On the second day of Vayek's flights, the Merit clan made their move. Not against the human camp, against Vayek. Specifically, the eldest of the Merit lords, a gray-scaled dragon named Sulk, who had been watching the situation from the high ridgeline with growing rage, decided that a dragon who carried human letters was not a dragon at all. He intercepted Vayek mid-flight over the valley between the eastern ridge and the river, with 3 younger males from his clan flanking him. Vayek saw them coming and did not change course. Sulk demanded he stop. Vayek stopped, not because Sulk demanded it, but because he wanted to. Sulk said in the formal tongue, "You carry their words, you sleep in their camp, you eat their food and speak to them like they are your kin. What has happened to you, Vayek? What have these creatures done to your mind?" Vayek said, "Nothing to my mind. They climbed a mountain in the dark." Sulk said, "I know what they did. It changes nothing. They are small and short-lived, and they will be gone in a century, and you will still be here, and what will you have wasted your years on?" Vayek said, "I don't think it's a waste." Sulk said, "The Merit clan has stood for 800 years. We have outlasted 40 human kingdoms. We will outlast this one. And when the last of these soldiers is dust, you will stand on this mountain and remember that you spent your days carrying their letters and opening their roads, and you will understand what you gave up." Vayek was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I spent 40 years alone on that mountain. I remember what that is like." He paused. "It is not better." Sulk looked at the three young males. Something was communicated between them, not in words, just in the way dragons hold their bodies. Sulk said, "We are not going to let you pass." Vayek said, "You are going to try to stop me." Sulk said, "Yes." Vayek said, "Then I suggest you warn the young ones, because I am not patient today and I have a letter to deliver." What followed was not a glorious battle. It was fast and brutal, and Vayek was 200 years older than any of them, and the canyon below the ridgeline rang with the sound of it for about 90 seconds, and then it was over. Two of the young males fled north. The third, the smallest, had a broken wing and came down in the river valley and did not fly again that day. Sulk himself circled once at high altitude, bleeding from a gash below his left eye, and then banked away into the clouds. Vayek checked the letter, still sealed, still dry, tucked in the harness Novan had made for him from folded leather and cord, which Vayek had complained about but worn anyway. Then he continued east. He delivered the message to the garrison commander, a stocky, disbelieving man named Orval, who opened the door of his command post, saw a dragon standing in his yard, and said absolutely nothing for 30 seconds. Vayek read Korath's seal to him, gave him the orders verbatim, and then said, "You have until tomorrow morning." Orval said, "Are you telling me what to do?" Vayek said, "I am telling you what Korath told you to do. The choice is yours." Orval looked at him for another long moment. Then he said, "How long did it take Korath to trust you?" Vayek said, "Ask the sergeant. I don't fully understand it myself." Orval looked at the seal. He looked at Vayek. He called for his officers. The garrison moved at dawn. Vayek was back in the main camp by midday, and the news came an hour behind him. The eastern garrison was moving north. The western detachment had received his first message the previous evening and was already repositioning, and Korath was marching the main force toward the ridgeline. The plan was in motion. Novan heard it all from dawn, and he went looking for Vayek and found him at the northern edge of the camp, sitting very still, not looking at the mountains for once. He was looking at his own hands, his clawed, ancient, stone-gray hands, the way a person looks at something familiar that has just become strange to them. Novan sat down nearby. He didn't say anything. After a while, Vayek said, "Sulk was not entirely wrong." Novan said, "No." Vayek said, "You will be gone in a century. This army, this kingdom, I will still be here." He looked at the mountains. He said, "I would regret it." Novan said, "Do you think you will?" Vayek said, "I think regret requires looking back. I have spent a great deal of my life looking back." He paused. "I am trying something different." Novan said, "How is it going?" Vayek said, "Ask me after the battle." The battle came 2 days later, not at the ridgeline, but below it. The Merit clan, having lost their most respected elder to an argument in a canyon and facing the coordinated movement of 3 human forces at once, sent a delegation to Korath's camp before the first blow was struck. Not a messenger, an actual delegation, 4 elders, including Sulk, who arrived with dried blood still on his scales and the careful bearing of something very old that has just realized it made a mistake. Korath met them outside. Vayek stood at her left. Novan stood at Vayek's left because Korath had quietly told him to. Sulk looked at the three of them, the general, the dragon, the sergeant, and his expression was not one of defeat exactly. It was the expression of a creature encountering something it had not included in its calculations and knowing it should have. He said to Vayek formally, "The Merit clan is prepared to discuss terms." Vayek said, "Speak to the general, she makes the terms." Sulk looked at Korath. His pride was enormous and visible, and he set it aside slowly, the way you set down something heavy. He said, "General." Korath said, "Sit down." He sat. The Karath clans turned north 6 days after the Merit terms were signed, not because they were beaten, they hadn't suffered a single engagement. They turned north because the territory guarantee dissolved with the Merit agreement, and without guaranteed southern land, the march was pointless. They were not enemies of the human kingdoms because they hated humans. They were enemies because there was territory available and a clan agreement in place. Remove the agreement, and the math changed. Dawn said it was like watching a market close. 1 minute the stalls were open, the next they weren't, and everyone went home. It wasn't a victory. Novan was careful to say that every time someone used the word. The kingdom was still damaged. 3 years of war had taken something that would take a generation to rebuild. But the army was intact, the pass was open, and the Merit clan had signed a non-aggression agreement that, if it held, would keep the northern route safe for at least a decade. The morning the Karath clans were confirmed to have turned, Korath called Novan into her tent and told him he was being promoted. He said, "To what?" She said, "Captain." He said, "I'm not sure I want to be a captain." She said, "Nobody who should be a captain ever does. That's the only qualification I actually trust." She slid the commission across the table. "Take it." He took it. Outside, he found Bren sitting on a supply crate, cleaning his boots, with the focused attention of someone who doesn't want to think too hard. Bren said, "Is it over?" Novan said, "This part." Bren nodded. He kept cleaning his boots. Then he said, "Do you think he'll stay?" Novan didn't have to ask who he meant. He went to find Vayek at the northern edge of the camp, where Vayek always was. The dragon was sitting with his back to the camp, facing the mountains, which was also where he always was. From behind, in the early morning light, he looked like part of the landscape, a grey outcropping that breathed. Novan sat nearby. For a while, neither of them spoke. Vayek said, "The Karath have turned." Novan said, "Yes." Vayek said, "You have your pass, you have your garrison, you have the agreement." Novan said, "Yes." Vayek said, "What do you need now?" Novan said, "I don't know yet, we're still working on that part." Vayek made a sound that might have been a laugh, low and brief, and not quite what a laugh should sound like, but close enough. He said, "You said that before." Novan said, "It's still true." They sat in silence again, a long one. The camp was waking up behind them, voices, boots on the dirt, the smell of the morning fire, the ordinary sounds of people starting another day. Vayek said, "Sulk told me I would regret this, that I would stand on a mountain a century from now and remember what I gave up." Novan said, "What did you give up?" Vayek thought about it, seriously, the way he thought about everything. He said, "Nothing I was using." Novan looked at him. Vayek said, "I had 40 years of solitude and certainty, and I knew exactly what every day would bring. And I gave that up to carry letters across a valley and be shouted at by Sulk and eat human bread, which is not as bad as I expected." Novan said, "That's what you gave up." Vayek said, "Yes." Novan said, "Do you regret it?" Vayek said, "No, I find that I don't." He was quiet for a moment. "I find that I am more interested in what comes next than I have been in a very long time." Novan said, "Then stay." Vayek said, "I am not a pet." Novan said, "No, you're the only person who can fly 100 miles in a day and also knows where every clan meeting in the last 300 years was held. That is not a pet. That's something we don't have a word for yet. Vayek said, something new. Novan said, something new. The mountain wind came through the camp and bent the fire smoke sideways and rattled the tent lines. The sun was fully up now, the kind of morning that is just a morning, with no particular quality except that it exists and is continuing, which is its own kind of thing. Vayek said, the merit agreement has 7 conditions. The clan lords will test condition 4 first. It is the most ambiguous. When they do, you will need someone who can read the exact language they use and know whether it is a genuine dispute or a test of your attention. Novan said, we will need that, yes. Vayek said, I know the exact language. I was at the founding meeting. Novan said, of course you were. Vayek stood. He stretched his wings, the full span, which still made the nearby sentries step back, which he had still not appeared to notice, or had noticed, and decided was not worth commenting on. He folded them again. He said, you know what I thought, that night in the canyon, when Sulk said I was wasting my years on creatures that would be dust in a century. Novan said, what did you think? Vayek said, I thought, yes, and then I thought, the dust has been in this valley for 10,000 years. New creatures walk on it every generation. It doesn't seem like a waste to me. It seems like the only thing that lasts. He turned and walked back into the camp. Not to the edge of it, where he always positioned himself, a presence at the perimeter, half in and half out. He walked through the middle of it, between the tents and the cookfires and the soldiers who made way for him, and then turned to watch him pass, some of them with their mouths open. Bren, still on his supply crate, still cleaning his boots, looked up as Vayek went past. He said, morning. Vayek said, morning. And he kept walking, and the camp went on around him, and nobody had a word yet for what he was, and he seemed entirely comfortable with that.